There is a specific smell in a good memory care hallway, and it is not the smell people expect. It is coffee and clean linen and something baking on Tuesdays because we bake on Tuesdays, and underneath all of it, so faint you'd miss it if you didn't know to listen for its absence, nothing wrong. My brother walked down that hallway on a Thursday afternoon in March, looking for a place to save our grandmother's life. He had no idea he was walking through the one I had spent 14 years building. My name is Marguerite Colby. I am 42 years old, and I run a 32-bed assisted living residence in Colorado Springs called Aspenwood. My brother Barry once told a room full of relatives that my career was glorified babysitting for old people. 16 years later, he stood in my lobby asking to babysit our grandmother there, and he did not recognize the name on my badge. Let me take you back to where all of this actually started. Before I do, if stories like this one matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps a channel like mine reach the people who need to hear it. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I read every single one, usually the same night. All right. Let's go back 16 years. I grew up in Manitou Springs, just outside Colorado Springs, in a narrow 2-story house at the base of Pikes Peak, and our family had one true center of gravity, and that was my father's mother, Opal. My own mother left when I was 6, and I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it's the reason Opal Colby raised half of my childhood herself. She did it in her kitchen with the yellow curtains, teaching me to roll pie crust with a jelly jar, because she didn't believe in a rolling pin. Her house smelled like cedar and coffee grounds, and she kept a police scanner on low in the evenings. Not because anything ever happened in Manitou Springs, but because she liked knowing the world was still out there, working, while she rolled dough at her own counter. My father, Ambrose, worked construction and worked it hard, and Opal was the soft, steady floor underneath both of us. Barry is 4 years older than me, and I want to be fair to him before I tell you the rest of this, because he was a good brother when we were young. He taught me to ride a bike on the gravel behind Opal's garage, running alongside me with one hand on the seat. He stayed long after he should have let go, because he didn't want to tell me he already had. He is not a cartoon villain in this story. He is a man who made a series of choices, and I am going to show you exactly what those choices cost. There is one more person from those years I need you to meet, because she is the actual reason I do what I do now, more than any degree I ever earned. Opal's own mother, my great-grandmother, spent the last 2 years of her life in a home health arrangement, and the aide who came 3 mornings a week was a woman named Louella, broad-shouldered, quiet-voiced. She used to let me sit on the porch step while she worked, and she once told me, very plainly, while braiding my great-grandmother's thin white hair, that the whole job was just this. Notice what a person needs before they have to ask for it twice. I was 11 years old. I did not understand yet that she had just handed me the entire shape of my future career in one sentence, but I never forgot it. 30 years later, the day Aspenwood opened, I had that sentence painted in small letters, inside every staff break room in the building, unsigned. Louella never gave me her last name, and I have spent years wishing I had asked. My father, Ambrose, died of a heart attack when I was 22, in the parking lot of the hardware store where he'd worked for 19 years. And after that, Opal was, in every real sense, both of our remaining parents. I went on to study gerontology and long-term care administration because I had watched my grandmother's own mother decline in a facility in Pueblo that I will be diplomatic and simply call inadequate. It was a place where the call lights sometimes blinked for 20 minutes before anyone answered. I once watched an aide feed 3 residents at once by walking a spoon between 3 trays, like a woman doing a magic trick nobody had asked to see. Something in me decided, at 19 years old, sitting in a plastic chair in that day room, that old people deserved rooms that smelled like nothing was wrong. I decided it hard enough that it became the whole architecture of my adult life. Bari went into insurance claims management, stayed in Colorado Springs, bought a house 4 miles from Opal's, and became, by simple proximity, the son who was there. Here is the sentence that explains everything that happened for the next 16 years, and I need you to hold on to it because it comes back later, word for word. When Opal turned 74, her doctor suggested she set up power of attorney, both financial and medical, and she called a family meeting at her kitchen table to decide who would hold it. I was 26, finishing my second year running a memory care wing in Denver, 4 hours away. Bari was 30, 4 miles away, married, steady job. Opal chose Bari, which I understood, and I want to be honest that I did not fight it at the time. What I did not understand until years later was what Bari told our Aunt Priscilla on the phone that same week, thinking I wasn't in earshot, standing in the hallway outside Opal's cracked bedroom door. He said, "Maggie's not around enough to know what Mom actually needs. She wouldn't recognize an emergency if she saw one." I stood in that hallway for a long moment. I did not walk in. I did not tell him I heard it. I carried that sentence for 16 years, the way you carry a stone in your shoe that you've decided isn't worth stopping to remove. It shaped more of my life than I let myself admit, including, if I'm honest, some of why I built what I eventually built. For the next decade, the pattern set itself the way patterns do, quietly, one reasonable decision at a time. Bari handled Opal's bills, her doctor's appointments, her small investment account. I called every Sunday. I flew back for holidays. I sent money when Opal's roof needed replacing, $4,000, no argument, no announcement. And every family gathering, in some form, Bari would mention, lightly, that it was good I called, since I couldn't really be counted on for the day-to-day. I built Aspenwood during those years, and I want to tell you honestly what that took, because it matters to the rest of this story, and because nobody in my family ever asked me a single question about it. I worked 2 administrator jobs at once for 4 years to save capital, one during the week at a memory care wing in Denver, and a second, weekends only, doing intake assessments for a hospice agency. I had done the math, and I knew exactly how many years it would take me to save enough at one salary, and the number was too large. I took out a business loan against my own condo, which meant if Aspenwood failed, I would have lost my home along with it. That was a fact I never once mentioned to Bari, because some version of me still expected him to say something about babysitting money. I spent 3 years, before that running a 9-bed group home out of a converted ranch house, learning the actual mechanics of the business on a scale small enough that my mistakes couldn't hurt too many people at once. I remember one January, in year 2 of that group home, when a payroll shortfall meant I paid my 3 aides in full and paid myself nothing for 6 weeks. I ate rice and the vegetables from a resident's daughter's garden, which she insisted on sharing with me because she'd noticed the way people in this business notice things. I do not tell you that story for sympathy. I tell you because it is the actual, unglamorous floor that Aspenwood was built on, and because glorified babysitting was never once the phrase I would have chosen for 6 weeks of rice and unpaid invoices. By the time I had the credentials and the funding to build something real, I had a very specific vision. 32 beds, memory care and assisted living both, on 4 acres east of the city, with mountain views from every south-facing room. I had read, in an actual clinical study, that a consistent mountain view measurably reduced agitation in dementia patients. And I decided that if Colorado Springs had given me that view for free my whole life, I could at least give it back to people who no longer got to choose their own window. When I told my family I was opening it, Bari's exact response at Thanksgiving in front of Opal was, "So you're basically opening a really nice babysitting service." Everyone laughed. Opal did not laugh. She caught my eye across the table and held it, steady as she'd ever been. Later, on her porch, wrapped in the quilt she kept over the porch swing every October, she told me she was prouder of me than she knew how to say to a room that wouldn't understand it. I want to tell you about the years after that, because this is not a story about silence. It's a story about 2 very different kinds of attention. I called Opal every Sunday at 6, without fail, for 11 years, 350 some odd calls I never missed even from hotel rooms at conferences. We talked about her garden and her programs on public television, and increasingly about small things she was starting to forget, a doctor's name, whether she'd taken her blood pressure pill. She started calling the metal claw she used to reach the high shelf, the reacher thing around year 8, a small slippage I logged in my own head, the way I log everything. It was out of habit, out of a professional reflex I never fully turned off even for my own family. I flew home 4 times a year, Thanksgiving, her birthday in April, a week in summer, and 1 long weekend in the fall, for no occasion at all, except that I wanted one. I paid for a lift chair when her knees went, $1,800, mailed directly to the medical supply company so there'd be no argument about a check. And a grab bar installer the year after that, and a service that brought her groceries on weeks when Bari's schedule got tight. All of it quiet, all of it handled the way I handle things, without a receipt read aloud at a family dinner. Bari, meanwhile, was the one who drove her to appointments and picked up her groceries the rest of the time. And I want to be completely fair. That is real, unglamorous, valuable work, showing up on a Tuesday in the rain because someone has to, and I have never once pretended it wasn't. There were Sundays I heard something tired in his voice when he handed the phone to Opal, a flatness I noted, and then, I am ashamed to say, filed away instead of following up on. I told myself he had it handled, the same words he would later use on me. And it did not occur to me that a person can say those words about himself just as easily as he can say them to someone else. What I did not know, because Bari never once mentioned it in 11 years of Sunday calls, was something else entirely. He had started drawing a monthly amount from Opal's account, $400, labeled in her own ledger, in his handwriting, as family caregiver stipend. I found that ledger by accident the week Opal moved into rehab after her hip surgery, when I was gathering her Medicare paperwork from the drawer in her nightstand. Underneath, it was a green cloth-covered notebook she'd kept faithfully for years, every deposit and withdrawal recorded in her own careful hand, the same hand that had once labeled recipe cards in that same kitchen. I sat on the edge of her empty bed in her empty house and read 4 years of entries in one sitting. Family caregiver stipend, $400. Family caregiver stipend, $400. The same 2 words repeating themselves down the page like a held note. And I want to tell you honestly that my first feeling was not anger. It was a strange, quiet grief for a version of my brother I hadn't let myself imagine, a man quietly bailing water out of his own boat every single month and never once asking either of us for a rope. I do not know exactly which year the withdrawals began. I only know that by the time I found that ledger, the entries went back far enough that I could not find the first one. And Opal's own handwriting, on nearly every page, next to the amount, said only, "For Bari, love Mom." It was as though she had decided, long before I ever found out, that this was simply one more way of taking care of her family. The trouble started 3 years ago, when Opal's memory had declined enough that living alone was no longer safe. A decision had to be made fast, because she'd left the stove on twice in 1 month, and a neighbor had called Bari, worried. A week later, she'd been found 2 blocks from her own house in her nightgown, calmly explaining to a startled jogger that she was walking to meet Ambrose, who had been dead for 20 years. I offered that week on the phone, standing in my own kitchen with my heart going too fast, to have her come stay at Aspenwood. At cost, not free, I want to be clear, but at my actual cost, no markup, roughly $3,800 a month for a private room with full memory care staffing, medication management, the works. Bari said, and this is close to verbatim, that he appreciated the offer but he had it handled, and that Opal needed to be close to family, not clear across town in some facility. Aspenwood is 11 minutes from Bari's house. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, the way I have sat with it for 3 years. Clear across town was never a true description of the distance between us. It was a description of something else he wasn't ready to say. What Bari chose instead was a facility called Meadowbrook Senior Living, on the north side of the city, $3,200 a month, $600 a month less than what I'd offered. I understand now, looking back, that the $600 was never really the point. It was the number he led with when he finally told me, almost apologetically, as though the savings were a gift he was giving me too. Meadowbrook was Bari's decision, made entirely without me, no phone call, no visit together. I found out about it from Opal herself 3 days after she moved in. She called me sounding smaller than I had ever heard her sound, asking, in a voice that kept trailing off, when I was coming to get her. I want to describe Meadowbrook honestly, because I have now walked through it twice, once as a granddaughter and once, later, as exactly what I actually am. It was a converted motor lodge from the 1980s, single-story, long straight hallways with fluorescent lighting, that buzzed audibly in 3 different places I counted myself. It was the kind of buzz that never fully leaves your ears once you've noticed it. The dining room served dinner at 4:30 in the afternoon, because that schedule required fewer overnight staff, not because any resident had asked for an early dinner. The staffing ratio, which I looked up because it is public record in this state, was 1 aide to every 18 residents on the day shift and 1 aide to every 26 overnight. At Aspenwood, our ratio is 1 to 8 during the day and 1 to 12 overnight. I am not telling you that number to brag. I am telling you that number because it is the entire difference between a fall being found in 4 minutes and a fall being found in 5 hours. Which brings me to February of this year, a Tuesday, 2 in the morning, when Opal got up to use the bathroom in her room at Meadowbrook and fell and broke her hip. She lay on the linoleum floor until the day shift found her at 7:15, 5 hours later. I need you to know that detail lived in my body for weeks after I learned it. 5 hours, on a cold floor, 86 years old. Calling out, according to the incident report I later obtained, though nobody logged exactly how long she'd been calling before someone finally heard her. I have run a facility for 14 years, and I know, in a way I wish I didn't, exactly what those 5 hours would have looked like from the inside. The ceiling tile she would have stared at, the specific quality of 2 in the morning quiet in a building, where the 1 aide on duty was almost certainly down a different hallway entirely. She was doing her honest best across too many rooms at once. Bari called me from the emergency room a little after 8 that morning, and his voice on the phone did not sound like the voice I had grown up with. It sounded thin, stretched over something, and to his credit, he was shaking, genuinely shaking, when I got there. I drove the 70 minutes from my own facility that morning without asking a single accusing question. That is not who I choose to be in a hospital corridor, not at 11 at night and not at 8 in the morning either. I sat with him in 2 stiff blue chairs bolted to the wall outside pre-op. I held Opal's hand while she was still groggy from the first round of pain medication, her fingers dry and cool in mine. That was the way they had felt when I was 7 years old and she walked me to the bus stop. She opened her eyes once and said my name, just my name, nothing else, and went back under. That was the night, or really that morning, in those stiff blue chairs, that I decided, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, that whatever happened next, she was never going back to that building. The state's health department investigated Meadowbrook after Opal's fall, because any hip fracture from an unattended fall triggers a mandatory review in Colorado. I want to tell you what that investigation found, because I did not manufacture a single word of it. I simply read the public report the way anyone can. It is a matter of public record, and I encourage anyone with a relative in long-term care to learn how to pull these reports for their own state. Insufficient overnight staffing on the date in question, 1 aide covering 26 residents where the facility's own posted plan called for 2. 2 prior unaddressed complaints regarding medication administration timing, filed by other families 8 months and 11 months before Opal's fall respectively, neither one resolved. A call light system with a documented average response time of 11 minutes against a state guideline of 5, measured across a sample the inspectors pulled themselves, not self-reported by the facility. Meadowbrook was issued a conditional license and a 90-day correction period. 6 weeks later, unable or unwilling to meet the staffing requirements, the owners surrendered their license and closed the facility entirely, displacing every resident inside it, not just my grandmother. I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because 29 other families got a phone call that same week that started the exact same way ours had. 2 days after the fall, once Opal was stable in the hospital, and before anyone had said the word investigation out loud, I drove to Meadowbrook myself, alone, without telling Bari. I needed to see the actual hallway with my own professional eyes before I let myself have an opinion about it. The facility director, a tired-looking man named Foster, who I do not believe was a bad person so much as an overwhelmed one, walked me through the wing where Opal's room had been. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, what his overnight staffing ratio actually was that Tuesday. He told me a number, and I told him evenly that the number did not match what I already knew from the call log times. I watched him decide, in real time, whether to lie to a stranger in a blazer or tell the truth to a stranger in a blazer. He told me the truth, which I will give him credit for even now. 1 aide, 26 residents, a second aide out sick with no replacement called in. I did not raise my voice in that hallway either. I simply thanked him and drove home and sat in my own car in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I already knew, by then, exactly what the state's own investigation would eventually confirm in writing. Opal spent 3 weeks in a rehabilitation hospital after her hip surgery, and that is where Bettina Roque enters this story, a hospital discharge planner whose job, every single day, is matching patients with somewhere safe to go next. It is a job I respect enormously because I have spent 14 years on the receiving end of exactly her kind of referral. I met her exactly once, briefly, in a hallway outside Opal's rehab room, and I promise you she had no idea who I was to Opal. She only knew Opal Colby needed a bed with strong fall prevention protocols and a hip that would need real physical therapy support. And she knew the family had already, in her professional assessment, been through one facility that had failed them. Bettina pulled the state's own quality ratings, the same public data anyone can access if they know to look, staffing ratios, complaint histories, inspection scores. Aspenwood was rated 5 stars, the only 5-star memory and assisted living facility within 20 miles. She told me in that one hallway conversation that she tries never to send a family back into a situation that already failed them once. She'd looked at Meadowbrook's own recent inspection history before crossing it permanently off any list she ever handed anyone again. She handed Bari a printed list of 3 names. Aspenwood was the first one on it, not because of anything to do with me, but because of 14 years of numbers I had never once bragged about at a family dinner. I sat with that green ledger for 3 full days before I said a word to anyone about it, turning the decision over, the way you turn a stone over, looking for the dry side. Part of me wanted to drive straight to Bari's house and set it on his kitchen table without a single word. And part of me, the part that has spent 14 years learning that shame rarely produces anything but more hiding, wanted to wait until I understood the shape of the whole thing before I said anything at all. I told nobody, not even Opal, who was still too foggy from the surgery and the pain medication to have carried the weight of it well. I put the ledger in my own bag, and I drove to work each of those 3 days, and I ran tour, and I signed payroll. Underneath all of it, I kept doing the arithmetic, $400 a month, for however many years, against $600 a month saved, at a facility where my grandmother had nearly died on a bathroom floor. None of the numbers ever quite added up to anger the way I expected them to. Mostly, they added up to a tired kind of sorrow, for a brother who had apparently decided, alone, without ever once picking up the phone to me, that his only two options were silent debt or silent shame. Here is what I need you to understand about my brother in this exact moment, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on. Bari was exhausted. He had been at that hospital every day for 3 weeks. He was scared, genuinely scared, of making the wrong call twice in 1 year. And he was, by his own later admission, barely reading anything at that point, just scanning names and phone numbers and driving to the first tour that would take him. He called Aspenwood's front desk on a Tuesday morning and asked for a tour that same afternoon. Our admissions coordinator, a young man named Tio who has worked for me for 2 years, told him, "Sure, come on by, ask for Marguerite when you get here. She runs tour on Thursdays and today happens to be one of them." I have wondered, more than once, whether Bari heard my name on that phone call and simply did not process it. That is the way you can hear a word 100 times and not truly register it until you see the actual person standing in front of you. I think that is exactly what happened. I think 3 weeks of hospital corridors and terror had worn a kind of static into him. And Marguerite is not, in fairness, an uncommon enough name in isolation to necessarily mean me, not to a man who hadn't spoken to his sister about her actual job in longer than either of us would admit out loud. I want to tell you what an ordinary Thursday at Aspenwood actually looks like, because I think it matters, and because Bari had never once asked. Breakfast runs from 7 to 9, staggered, because nobody in memory care should ever be rushed through a meal. We have a resident named Wendell who was a Navy machinist for 30 years and insists on folding his own napkin into a triangle every single morning. And an aide named Chantal who has learned to fold it wrong on purpose sometimes, just so he has something satisfying to correct. We have physical therapy at 10, a music program on alternating days, a courtyard with raised garden beds. Half our residents spent 60 years with their hands in dirt, and stopping that cold does something to a person that no medication fixes. I do walkthroughs every morning myself, every hallway, every dining room, because Lawella taught me, without ever knowing she was teaching me anything, that the whole job is noticing before you're asked twice. I have built an entire career and an entire building out of one sentence, a home health aide said to an 11-year-old on a porch step 40 years ago. None of that was in any brochure Bettina handed my brother. It was simply what he walked into, on a Thursday, looking for somewhere safe to put our grandmother, without knowing he already knew the person who'd built it. So let me ask you something, before I take you into that lobby, because I think about it every time I tell this story. Have you ever been so buried in exhaustion and fear that you missed something completely obvious, something that would have been unmissable on any ordinary day? A name, a face, a fact sitting right there in plain sight, waiting for a version of you with enough sleep to actually see it. Tell me about it in the comments. I promise you it will make somebody else watching feel less alone in whatever they're carrying right now, And I read every single one, usually with my own coffee going cold beside me. All right. Deep breath. Let's walk into that lobby together, because I have told this part of the story more times now than any other, and it still catches somewhere in my chest every single time. Thursday, March the 14th, 2 in the afternoon. I do every tour myself when I can, because I built this place to be shown by someone who actually knows every square foot of it. That Thursday, I had 2 families scheduled, one at 1 o'clock and one at 2. I was in my office finishing paperwork on the first tour when Tio knocked and said the 2 o'clock family was in the lobby, a Mr. Colby. And I remember pausing for exactly 1 second on the surname, the way you do when you hear something plausible but not yet certain. I told myself Colby is not an unusual name in this state, and I picked up my folder and walked out to the lobby, the way I do for every single family who walks through that door. Bari was standing by our fireplace looking at the mountain photographs on the wall, the ones from Aspenwood's first groundbreaking, 14 years of us in hard hats on bare dirt. He turned around when he heard footsteps, already starting to say something polite, some version of good afternoon he'd probably said to strangers in waiting rooms 50 times that month. And then he stopped, completely, mid-sentence, with his mouth still slightly open on a word he never finished. I want to describe his face honestly, because I have thought about it more than almost any other moment in my adult life. It went through 3 distinct stages in maybe 4 seconds. First, simple confusion, the kind you'd have seeing a coworker at the grocery store, a face that doesn't belong in this particular room. Then recognition, sharp and sudden, his eyes going wide, his whole body going still the way a deer goes still. And then last, something that looked almost like fear, though I didn't understand yet what he was afraid of. Tio, standing a few feet behind me with a clipboard, told me afterward that he genuinely thought, for 1 second, that Bari was about to be sick right there on our lobby rug. He said, "Maggie, what are you doing here?" And I said, still holding my folder level and calm because that is the only way I know how to run this building. I own this building, Bari. What are you doing here? He said, "I'm looking at it for Mom. The discharge planner recommended it. I didn't." And then he stopped again. I watched him do the math in real time, watched him connect Aspenwood, the 5-star facility on Bettina's printed sheet, to me. He connected it to the sister he had spent 16 years describing as not around enough to know what Mom needed. He said, "Quieter now, this is yours, all of this." I said, "I've owned it for 11 years, Bari. I built it." And there was a silence in that lobby that I will remember for the rest of my life. Into that silence, without meaning to, without even fully registering what he was doing, Bari said the exact sentence I had carried in my shoe for 16 years, word for word. Except this time he wasn't saying it to Priscilla in a hallway. He was saying it, disbelieving, almost to himself, standing in the one place on earth that proved him wrong. He said, "I just always figured you weren't around enough to know what Mom actually needed." I did not raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice inside these walls, not in 14 years, and I was not about to start over my own brother's disbelief. I said, quietly, "I heard you say that exact sentence to Aunt Priscilla when I was 26 years old, Bari, standing in Grandma's hallway. I have heard it in my head every single year since. And now you've said it again, In the building I built specifically because I have spent my entire adult life thinking about exactly what mom, and women just like her, actually need. Bari sat down, hard, on the small sofa near our fireplace, the one we keep there specifically for moments when a family needs to sit down without being asked twice. He did not argue with me. He put both hands over his face for a long moment, long enough that Tio quietly stepped back, toward the front desk to give us room. When Bari took his hands away, something in his voice had changed, gone smaller, gone closer to the voice he'd had as a boy running alongside my bicycle. He said, "I could not afford the place I wanted for her, Maggie. I never told you that. I got quietly let go from my supervisor position 2 years before her fall, some restructuring thing, no warning. I took a lower job just to stay employed, and I was terrified to tell anyone, especially you, because you'd built this whole empire out of rice and unpaid weeks I never even knew about. And I couldn't even keep my own house payment current some months. Meadowbrook was $600 less. That stipend I took wasn't extra. It was the difference between me keeping my lights on and not. I told myself it was fair. I told myself she'd have wanted to help me, the way she'd helped both of us our whole lives. I told myself a lot of things, sitting at her kitchen table with her ledger open, telling myself every single one of them like they were true. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it complicates the story people want, and I promised you honesty at the start of this. I felt real, unwanted sympathy for my brother, sitting in my lobby, smaller than I had ever seen him. I also felt something harden in me at the same time, because sympathy for his fear did not erase 5 hours on a cold floor. Both of those things were true at once, and I have stopped expecting them to cancel each other out. I did not say another word about the money or the stipend that afternoon. I had the ledger in my bag the entire time, 3 feet from where he sat with his hands over his face. And I made the decision, in that exact moment, to leave it there, because I understood, watching him, that he already knew every entry in it far better than I ever could. I said one thing, and I meant every syllable of it. I said, Opal is moving in here at cost, $3,800 a month, the same offer I made you 3 years ago. And I am naming myself as her secondary healthcare agent alongside you, not instead of you, because this is not about taking anything away from you. It is about making sure what happened in February never happens to her again. Bari did not argue. He signed the paperwork himself, in my office, 40 minutes later, his hand noticeably unsteady on the last line. When he finished, he slid the pen back across the desk to me, the way you'd hand someone a tool you were relieved to finally set down. I want to walk you through what actually happened after that, because this is the part these stories usually rush past, and I refuse to rush it. Opal moved into room 14 at Aspenwood on the 22nd of March, a south-facing room with a view of Pikes Peak from her own bed. It was the same mountain she used to point out to me from her own porch swing 40 years earlier. Within 11 days, her physical therapist had her walking the hallway with a cane, slow, determined laps past the fireplace, where her grandson had once sat down smaller than she'd ever seen him. Within 6 weeks, she was strong enough to bake, under close supervision, in our activity kitchen on a Tuesday, the first thing she'd baked in 4 months. She made snickerdoodles, using a jelly jar instead of a rolling pin, because some things a person's hands simply do not forget even when other things start slipping. She gave the first one to a staff member named Delphine, a woman in her 50s who came to us 4 years ago, after 12 years at a hospital oncology ward. Delphine says often that this work is gentler on her heart, even though the ending is the same one everybody eventually reaches. She has become, unofficially, Opal's favorite person in the building, the one she asks for by name if she wakes up disoriented at 3 in the morning. And I want you to know that detail, because it matters more to me than almost anything else in this story. My grandmother is safe, and she is baking again. And somebody who is not me and not Bari gets to have a cookie handed to her with pride in it, warm, from a woman who is finally, after 3 years, in the right room. I also filed a formal complaint with the state ombudsman's office regarding the conditions at Meadowbrook, based entirely on the public investigation record, not on anything private or invented. 30 other families had loved ones in that building, and most of them will never see the inspection report I read. And most of them do not have 14 years of industry knowledge, telling them exactly which sentence in a public document to underline. I filled out that complaint form at my own kitchen table on a Sunday night, the same night I would ordinarily have been on the phone with Opal at 6. It took me 40 minutes to write 4 paragraphs because I kept stopping to make sure every single word of it was something I could stand behind under oath, if it ever came to that. I did not do it to punish anyone. I did it because I have spent 14 years believing that the whole point of what I do is that nobody's grandmother should lie on a floor for 5 hours. Silence about that felt like a kind of complicity I was no longer willing to carry. Bari and I are, in a phrase I've made a kind of peace with, still working on it. He calls me now, actually calls, not just at holidays, sometimes just to ask how a particular Tuesday went, which is a question he never once asked in 11 years of my Sunday calls to him. Twice he has asked me real questions about staffing ratios and medication protocols, the way you ask someone whose actual expertise you have finally allowed yourself to see. Once, in May, he sat in on a full care conference with Opal's physical therapist and asked better questions than I did, which surprised us both. He has never once, since that Thursday, called what I do glorified babysitting. He pays the difference between Meadowbrook's old rate and Aspenwood's real one out of his own pocket now, a few $100s a month, without my ever asking him to. I have never once made him explain why, because I think we both understand it without either of us saying it out loud. He also has not fully said the word sorry, not the whole word, though he came close once, standing in the hallway outside Opal's room in April, watching her nap through the open door. He said, "I got it wrong for a long time, Mags," and I watched what that cost him to say, the way his jaw worked before the sentence came out. I let it be enough for that particular day, because I have learned that some apologies arrive in pieces, and you can either refuse the pieces or you can let a person hand them to you one at a time. We had dinner together in June, just the two of us, no Opal, no occasion, at a diner we used to go to as kids. He told me, unprompted, about the job loss, the whole of it this time, dates and numbers. It was the way a person talks when they have finally decided the shame of a thing is smaller than the weight of carrying it alone. I did not forgive him out loud that night, and I did not need to. I ordered pie. He remembered I always got the cherry. Aunt Priscilla, the one Bari was talking to on the phone that day 16 years ago, is 81 now and still comes to every family gathering. Last Christmas, without my ever having told her the whole story, she pulled me aside in Opal's new dining room and said she'd always thought Bari had been too hard on me growing up. She said she'd never fully agreed with what he'd said about me back then, and had simply never known how to say so out loud in the moment. I did not tell her I had heard the original sentence myself, standing in a hallway at 26. Some things, I have decided, are mine to keep, not because they are secrets, but because they are simply, quietly finished. I still do every Thursday tour myself, and every single time I walk a frightened, exhausted family through those doors, I think about my brother standing by that fireplace, 3 weeks into the worst month of his life. I think about him seeing his own sister's name on a badge he hadn't let himself read in 16 years. I think, too, about Lauella, whose last name I never learned, and about Opal at her kitchen table with a jelly jar instead of a rolling pin. And I think about how every good thing I have ever built traces back, in some quiet way, to a woman noticing what somebody else needed before they had to ask for it twice. That is the whole of it, really, underneath the ledgers and the lobbies and the state investigations. Before I leave you with what all of this actually taught me, tell me something honestly in the comments. Do you have a person in your life whose whole profession you dismissed, whose actual competence you never let yourself look at directly? I'd like to know, because I think it's more common than any of us admit. And if you want more true stories like this one, subscribe. There's another one waiting, and it starts with a woman finding a lease she never signed. Here is what 14 years of this work, and one Thursday afternoon, actually taught me, and I want to leave these with you plainly. The cheapest option is rarely actually the cheapest. It just moves the cost somewhere less visible and moves it onto whoever is least able to object. Bari saved $600 a month at Meadowbrook. And the true cost of that decision turned out to be a fractured hip, a state investigation, and 30 families displaced when the doors finally closed, none of which showed up on the monthly invoice he was comparing against mine. Real cost does not disappear when you choose the lower number. It just waits somewhere you weren't looking. Usually a hallway at 2 in the morning, or a ledger nobody reads, until it's too late to ask the person who kept it why. If you are choosing between cheap and safe for someone who cannot advocate for themselves, ask what the lower price is actually made of, and ask it before the bill comes due in a currency you can't pay back. A person can dismiss your competence for 16 years and still be telling you, the whole time, exactly what he is afraid of, if you know how to listen for it. Bari never once believed I was incompetent. I understand that now, though it took a hospital corridor and a lobby confrontation to get me there. He believed, underneath it, that if my career was real and impressive, his own quiet, unglamorous proximity to Mom would stop counting as enough, would get filed under merely showing up while I got filed under actually succeeding. Calling my work babysitting protected something fragile in him, not something cruel, a distinction I did not have the grace to make for most of those 16 years. Before you go to war with someone who has spent years minimizing you, ask what smaller, more frightened person that minimizing was actually built to protect. It might change how you choose to answer them, though it will not, and should not, Change whether you protect the person he was neglecting in the meantime. You can hold someone accountable and still show up for them in the same week, and I want you to hear that as permission, not a contradiction. I filed a state complaint. I also sat in a hospital corridor holding my brother's hand while he shook, and later bought him a slice of cherry pie at the diner where we were kids together. Both of those were true within the same year, sometimes within the same 72 hours, and I no longer believe accountability and compassion are opposites fighting for the same chair at the same table. If you are caring for someone vulnerable, alongside a family member who has failed at it, you are allowed to protect the vulnerable person fiercely, in writing, with the state, if it comes to that. And you can still remember that the person who failed is also someone you have loved since before either of you could talk. Both of those loves are allowed to live in the same chest, without one canceling the other out. The room a person ends up in says less about what they deserve than about who was finally paying attention to which room it actually was. Opal spent 3 years in a hallway that smelled faintly, underneath the coffee and the clean linen, like something being missed. None of us noticed the smell until a state inspector was paid to notice it for us. She spent her most recent Tuesday handing a snickerdoodle to a woman named Delphine, with her own 2 steady hands, in a room with her own mountain in the window. The difference between those 2 rooms was never about my grandmother. She was the same brave, particular woman in both of them. It was about who finally looked closely enough to notice which room she was actually in, and who was willing to say so, out loud, in a lobby, to someone who did not want to hear it that day. If you love someone who cannot advocate for their own room right now, go look closely. Go smell the hallway. It will tell you the truth faster than anyone's paperwork will, and it will not need you to raise your voice to do it.